World War II was quite different than World War I. There's no presumption that you should have world wars follow the same pattern, but one of the deviations is that it will not be in Europe, and it won't be over Europe. It will be over what the global crucible of power is, which in this case is increasingly the Gulf and the Red Sea and those areas.
Conflicts of Interest, brought to you by ACLED.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Conflicts of Interest. I'm here with the very lovely Bron. Hello.
Hello, and we're back in action. I mean, the news has been kind of relentless, but again, it feels like there's just these ongoing conversations. Last week, we really unpicked all sorts of power and control elements, didn't we? With who's friends with who's having lunch and secret meetings with who. And now it seems like we're back on some kind of territorial conversation around arguably the most famous strait in the world.
Yes, I do think that for any listeners who may think that they're listening to this on repeat, there is in fact a kind of slow burn crisis occurring. It was burning faster, now it's burning slower. And as predicted, the burn is starting to dissipate in some areas while spreading to others. And I think that it sometimes is useful to come back to really the epicenters of some of these bigger issues to understand which direction global conflict is moving towards. So to your point, Bron, there has been a little bit of a flare, of course, between Ukraine and Russia, especially around internal politics in both countries, potentially seeking to change the strategy of the conflicts for both. That's been happening for now quite a few weeks and months in both places, but maybe it's more pronounced at the moment in Ukraine. Whereas in the Gulf and, of course, around the Strait of Hormuz, there's still a lot of rhetoric. There is, again, a lot of domestic politics in both the US and Iran about how to move forward, what would be the best strategy. This stage of the conflict is really, I think, starting to create frayed ends, both in the domestic sphere in Iran, where some hardliners just want to keep going and make sure that they really break a number of old standing alliances within the Gulf. Whereas the US is thinking to themselves that they need to put more and more pressure that's not military pressure on Iran. Both strategies seem to be pretty poorly thought out, but they're not dealing with a wealth of choices.
When it comes to what people are hearing about these developments, Trump has said that America has total control of the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, I mean, that's utter nonsense, right? But that is exactly the kind of thing he's going to say. And I pride myself on not having Trump derangement syndrome, right? But that doesn't mean that I can't recognize that he's gone into full fantasist mode when it comes to what's happening within the strait, or more broadly, what's happening within the world and the US role in it. So I would say that absolutely everything that's coming out of his mouth at the moment is a fiction when it comes to the situation in Iran.
I think that's very widely applicable when he's talking about the situation right now. What do you think about that when it comes to the threats that he's making? Because what he's promised is an economic D-Day against Iran. So this is the hitting back and the targeting of their interests and power plants, which of course Iran is hitting back at with any supporting countries, like the power that the UK is running and the reported cyber attacks. There's a kind of undertone, isn't there?
So Iran is economically hurting in the same way that it was 6 months ago, but it's obviously now quite a bit worse. There was a period in the early summer where the countries around the Gulf were offering masses of money in order to allow for their ships to go through. So you might remember, I believe it was UAE gave them 20 billion. So that relieved some of the pressure. That ended, if you might remember, especially with the Southern strategy, which we spoke about a few weeks ago. And Iran is back to being in a pretty dire straits internally. There's no question there. They have some abilities to do kind of more sabotage-based engagements, whether it's hybrid or cyber or just kind of creating disorder. They've been doing that for decades. It's not as if it would be a change in strategy. Potentially who they focus on may be. However, in the US case, you might remember again that a lot of this is rhetoric in the sense that Trump had mentioned, to everybody's shock, I think, again about 6 months ago, that he was going to destroy the Iranian cities, roads, bridges, infrastructure, the salinization or desalinization plants, of course. And there was a lot of panic about it. I think that they are no more planning on doing it tomorrow than they were then, and they didn't do it then.
So the threats around the sanctions then, what will have to be different to actually have the impact that Trump is kind of envisioning from these? And presumably he would need support from other countries enforcing similar sanctions, wouldn't he?
You know what's happening here is that everybody's waiting for some unknown variable to change the stakes for one or both parties, or even the third parties involved, which is the Gulf states, of course. They're just desperate for something to give in order to provide more options. But nothing is giving just at the moment, right? And how long that can last, how long that the US will be so hesitant to get involved. Of course, they have supply issues that we'll cover next week. How long Iran will choose this kind of harassment and let's just say kind of local terrorism of the Strait. All those things can go on indefinitely. They don't want them to. They want something to give, but they're not in control of the variables that can create a new reality for either party. So what we're watching is just, what is the word for it?
I'm assuming you're thinking of something more sophisticated than bollocks.
No, it is bollocks, but it's more like attrition, right? It's just a war of attrition at this point where they both are waiting for the other to give up because those are the variables they can see in front of them. I don't know what the other potential variables are. There's the ability for what we spoke about last week, which is this kind of Arab League, I would almost call it again, but of course it includes Pakistan, so that doesn't quite fit. But these new alliance structures to make decisions that are going to change the direction of travel in the region, but that won't in such a short time. So I think everybody is just in a holding pattern. I mean, it's super grating, of course, and it's wearing everybody down. It's wearing everybody down before there will be a surge in conflict. And that's potentially one of the more worrying parts.
So this is all ahead of a press conference that's due today around 6:00 this evening. And the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, wrote in the FT yesterday some of the most dramatic writing for what I fear might be the biggest anticlimax we may well have seen so far. He wrote, "At dawn begins an economic D-Day, the single greatest financial offensive ever marshaled against an adversary."
I mean, maybe Scott Bessent should do more historical reading, but I won't go into that notion. But today, right now on the FT, it says Iran threatens 46 ships in Strait of Hormuz transit crackdown. So again, you just kind of have two moves one way, one move the next day. There's a great Bruce Springsteen song called 2 Steps Back. And this is a great song for this conflict.
Yeah. And as well with Iran saying that anyone of their allies or friends or connections to be seen to help or aid the US, they've declared that being an act of war. How can that be enforced?
I mean, it can't, but also who's Iran to go around threatening people, in a serious way? I think that one of the things that gets misconstrued in this contest is that the implication that they're equally able fighting partners. And while certainly Iran has, let's say, bested the US and actually, no, I would not say they've bested Israel because Israel's been kept out of this one. And I think that there's for every reason to think that Israel could have gone much further had the US had the appetite for it before. Iran is not an equivalent power in any way, shape, or form to the US. They simply planned better, right? They had a better strategy. They had better tactics. And that, as we've just discussed in reference to kind of other decisions by the US administration and the previous US administration, that's not a difficult hill to climb, having better ideas than the administration. So what I would say is that until somebody is able to make some considered decisions about a long-term strategy, and by long-term I mean longer than a few weeks in the Middle East, this conflict is not going to change the terms. So we'll see lots of increasingly ridiculous rhetoric, but nothing particularly changing on the ground. I will say that what we're moving towards here is that if there is any sort of massive global contest, it will be here. It'll be over this region. I'm writing the Raleigh report at the moment, and I'm struck by the notion that World War II was quite different than World War I. They didn't look the same. There's no presumption that you should have world wars follow the same pattern. But one of the deviations, of course, is that it will not be in Europe. and it won't be over Europe. It will be over what the global crucible of power is, which in this case, of course, is increasingly the Gulf and the Red Sea in those areas.
Another kind of parallel people draw if they're comparing these kind of wars that impact the whole world is the far-reaching nature of those impacts because of the technology and the interconnected economies and all of those things. And there's been those links recently, hasn't there, about the Iran hackers have been blamed for the cyber attacks that took a British power plant offline. And the government have then responded by briefing energy bosses about how to best protect their infrastructure. And obviously that would be regarded as an escalation on that front, wouldn't it? What's the appeal to Iran if this turns out to be the case on kind of having these far-reaching attacks, if you like, that don't look like bombs and drones?
I think that disorder always has a real attraction to Iran, to Russia, to North Korea. In fact, if you remember the kind of axis of evil, many of them enjoy destabilizing their direct or even indirect enemies. And it's because in the West, we have such a low threshold for disorder and so many vulnerabilities. So an extended period of peace has allowed people to get pretty lazy about where threats will come from and how to mitigate them. But also, it's extremely low in the prioritization list about what to deal with. So in countries such as European states, of course, the US, etc., that are going through, for example, a cost of living issue where they're, again, and this is super important, where the domestic politics is laser focused on small issues that, for example, a man who is supposed to be prime minister but thinks of himself as a mayor likes to handle, then these are perfectly sized, right? Big issues, which is how do you prepare yourselves for the next 50 years of conflict? Or how are you changing your defense and security parameters in order to deal with the known vulnerabilities in your system and how bad actors will seek to exploit those? Those are questions no one really wants to grapple with, because the best you can do is prevent something, which is not something you can see, which is not something that's useful in electoral politics.
And it's interesting because the attacks that the UK is maybe more susceptible to, if we're looking at the relationships between us and the Middle East at the moment, the various connections with each other's friends who they've decided is a bad actor. And I think you're absolutely, we are not in any position to cope with anything quite directly right now. But to what extent do you think that that is the new go-to for these powers that we're talking about? Because they know that side of the world has got those weak spots in cybersecurity.
Well, I mean, why wouldn't you do it? It's such a low cost option to both look like you are trying to do something to be relevant. That's another thing that people might discount, which is that it makes Iran relevant to the UK in ways that it's not at the moment, right? And it's not as if it's got a reputation to recoup. Right? That's another. So why not do it? It's certainly financially really lucrative to engage in these behaviors. Certainly Russia has found that out, and many post-Soviet states have allowed this to go on because it's lucrative. I think fraud, criminality used towards the outcome of political violence, money laundering, all of that is going to become much more obvious and present to us as more and more nefarious actors are seeking to solidify their position going forward. And yeah, it's a worry. It's a big worry. It should be, right? Because conflict isn't all, front lines and fighter jets and drones and kidnappings and violence against civilians. It's a lot of this kind of organization and management, getting money, trying to destroy different elements of safety of your enemy. It's comprehensive. And I think when recently somebody said that, these are acts of war, it's not a bad way to look at it. They are early acts, certainly.
And an interesting development recently has been the increased targeting this year from both Russia and Ukraine on infrastructure that's related to storing or transporting grain, and particularly the maritime angle with the Black Sea. But that's almost taking it, right back to where we kind of started, which is the lifeblood of those countries, isn't it?
Food security, energy security, physical security, cyber security, maritime security, assassinations of leaders, all of these are considered fair game, right? Even we at ACLED are, of course, laser focused on only particular forms of this insecurity, but they are all likely to be equally important components going forward of how these wars will be fought, especially by wars involving states. Wars involving states have the capabilities, they have the talent, they have the perseverance, they have the abilities to start really messing with each other, for lack of a better term. So I've been listening to this incredible old book, which I've listened to a few times, but it's called The Odessa Files, and it's by Frederick Forsyth. It must have been written in the 60s. And it's about people of the former SS, so SS officers in the Nazi regime, and how they reintegrated into German society. And this is a novel about somebody trying to find the butcher of Riga. What's really interesting is that at one point somebody gives a description of the various components of the SS. There was quite a number that were involved in the economic functioning of the Nazi regime. So how much they could take from especially the Jewish population that they were targeting and then exterminating. And there was also, of course, the police. There was the communications, there was the operations, there was, of course, the Gestapo themselves, there was the torture organization, and they were all part of the same umbrella organization. But my point here is that the idea that you would have a comprehensive and fully kind of societal plan to engage in conflict is not a new one. I just think that it's a lesson that we've forgotten from previous wars.
It's really interesting. And as we've been recording, there's been news out from Russia about some Ukrainian strikes that have been targeting the sites that belong to Wildberries, which I believe is Russia's second largest online retailer. And so Ukraine is justifying that targeting by saying that those sites have been supplying components to the military, and Moscow saying, no, they haven't, so they're not legitimate sites. And so apparently the threats now are around opening this Pandora's box about how Russia now is the door open kind of thing to attack similar economic targets that are kind of most sensitive and important to them.
Yes, I think that everybody should be aware that private businesses, even if they are not involved in military activity, are going to be considered fair game. So anything that's propping up the economy of a state, or Amazon, I believe, had one of their data centers attacked in the Gulf a few weeks ago in Bahrain. These attacks are going to effectively be saying these are representations of the states in many ways. We're going to raise the cost of engaging in these locations so much without some sort of negotiation with us more broadly that it will become a chokehold on the ability to do business in any of these places. And the Gulf cannot have that. Equally, Russia, of course, cannot look like their businesses are under attack. In fact, this led to a fire and everything else. But in part because Putin has gone to such lengths to basically claim that this is going to be kind of neutral, if you will, for Russia. This is going to be cost neutral for Russia and Russians. It's bloody nonsense. It's going to hit them. It's going to hit them a lot. Now, whether or not that actually changes the power structure, who knows? The benefit is not on the side of the Russian people here, but the cost is certainly going to be borne by them.
Yeah. And I know we've been mentioning the Gulf in passing, but I think it is worth bringing up the Houthis, isn't there? Their attacks on Saudi ships and oil and infrastructure last week, and then the attacks on an airport and was it the Aramco facilities inside Saudi Arabia?
Yeah. Again, I will say that Saudi's main position here is for restraint and pragmatic action. The Houthis, you'll never know troublemakers like them. And they're the last people you want living on the bottom of your garden, which is unfortunately for Saudi Arabia, the possession there. So yes, there's kind of continued attempts to destabilize Saudi, just like we were talking about destabilizing parts of the West. And they're hitting them where they hurt. They are expecting, I would imagine, a negotiation of quite a lot of benefits and money in order to make it worth their while to stop. Again, everybody's in a renegotiation stage for the status that they can bring to either an alliance or a position within this current conflict and the conflicts to come. Everybody's going to be acting badly. Everybody.
And we spend a lot of time talking about the Strait of Hormuz, but am I right in thinking that the Houthis have the ability to threaten shipping around the Red Sea and beyond, and there's some other really important strategic routes that they're across or can threaten that would have those kind of knock-on global impacts?
I mean, these choke points, there's only about 6 or 7 in the world more broadly, but they are considered so vital because of how many direct and then really diffuse and contiguous effects that they have on stability, but also just generally how trade, stability, alliances, politics, all the things happen to flow. So we may have the exact same conversation next week, although next week I promise it will be a little different because I'll focus a little bit more on material and defense spending. But this is going to be a long slog.
You've been listening to Conflicts of Interest with Professor Clionadh Raleigh, brought to you by ACLED, the world's leading source of political violence and protest data. Subscribe so you never miss an episode, and follow us on socials for updates in the meantime.